Hey guys, welcome back to The Thoughtful Therapist. It comes to my attention that I may have not clearly defined what the purpose of this podcast is. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes describing it. So as a clinical mental health counselor, my job is to sit in the room with people as they describe how they think about every aspect of their life. And one of the things that really stands out to me is how differently everyone seems to think about the same topics. Now, none of them are wrong and none of them are right, but they are all interesting. And it's really interesting how we get there. And so the idea of this podcast is something like just trying to be able to blend as many of those thoughts and ideas together in a way that we can all kind of understand. Not because they're the correct way of thinking about it, right, wrong, anything like that. Just because I think that sitting and thinking with these ideas is kind of how we gain an understanding of the world around us. So with that said, without any judgment or prescription, this is the Thoughtful Therapist podcast. This is episode 11. It's going to be on the ripple effect. And it's funny because on all of my years, one of the most profound ideas, I think I'd say, that I've come across is this ripple effect idea. And it's the idea that while my presence has an impact on others through actions and sometimes just through my presence, my being there in and of itself, that impact isn't really controlled by me. And it's not really controlled at all. This same realization flipped in the other direction is that something like other people may have an impact on me sometimes, and sometimes profoundly, but they don't control the direction or fate of mine. They can't. And herein lies the idea of the ripple effect. The ripple effect is often confused with the butterfly effect, and they're pretty similar. They're similar enough to where people really use them interchangeably. But I don't think they're quite as similar as people think they are. I don't think they're speaking to the same idea. Again, they're similar, but the butterfly effect is pretty chaotic. It's immediately, and it's really difficult to trace. Where the ripple effect is more gradual, it's often far more traceable, at least for a short period of time. But they live on different planes, right? The butterfly effect grows out of chaos theory, the idea that incredibly complex systems allow tiny changes in them to eventually lead to a dramatically different outcome. The classic image, of course, is the flap of a butterfly's wings could start a hurricane in the future under just the right conditions. Now, whether that specific example is literally true or isn't really isn't the point. The point is that complex systems can be remarkably sensitive to small changes. That's the idea of the butterfly effect. And while I think that's an absolutely fantastic idea, it's just not quite what we're talking about here today. Now, the ripple effect, at least as I understand it, feels much more personal. And I'm not really thinking about weather patterns or mathematical chaos. I'm thinking about interactions, conversations, events, families, friendships, kindness, strangers, resentments, and the ways in which ordinary people kind of become part of one another's stories, whether they intend to be or not. And in my understanding, the ripple effect means my presence, behaviors, actions, and interactions ripple outwards, not unlike a stone hitting water. It's my impact on the world around me, and it's consequential. It's just not really predictable enough to be able to write any sort of neat theory around. The ripple travels ever outward, creating more and more circles until it either fizzles out or hits an immovable object. So the central question becomes this: are we responsible for every outcome those ripples create, or simply for the specific stone we chose to throw to make the ripple? And that's kind of the idea for today's episode. So let's dive into it. So I'm a pretty firm believer in that we all share, for this analogy, we all share the same waters. And life isn't always a still pond, right? Ripples don't always spread neatly as they go out. Sometimes you'll find yourself in a flowing stream or a rushing river, or even maybe a stormy ocean. But the water itself is also always changing. But it's always shared. There are always other people throwing their own stones and all around us making their own ripples, with their ripples colliding with ours. Sometimes the very same stone thrown into different water creates completely different ripples. And I think that's part of what makes life so difficult to understand. Because by the time you and I throw our first stone in the morning, the water's probably already moving. The ripples from our families, our histories, disappointments, grief, cultures, personalities, interactions, none of us are really throwing into still water normally. We're kind of throwing those stones into water conditions that we didn't create. So let me set the stage for this. We'll say that there's a gentleman, I don't know, we'll say a boss, who's been, we'll say, just moving into a new apartment after divorcing his wife. And let's say that the night before, he gets served those final divorce papers. Right? And we could say that the ripple for this example starts there. And he wakes up the next day. Do you think he slept well? Probably not. You think he's in a good mood? No. So he goes to work. And his ripple interferes with another lady's. And this lady, we'll say, is a wife and a mother of two. And they've been collaborating for a long time. He's promised her a promotion, but she does something wrong. So instead of promoting her, he screams at her in front of all of the staff. And she doesn't get promoted. What happens to the mom then? Let's say she goes home after having this doozy of a day, and the house is disorganized. Okay. Now let's say that her husband and children are playing outside, having the time of their lives. How's mom going to feel about that? How is she going to react? Probably not as well as she would want her to. Now, these are all probabilities, of course. But let's say that she then goes outside and yells at her husband and her kids for not cleaning the house and instead going outside and playing. Okay. And then she retreats into her bedroom. What happens to that ripple? Does it stop or does it continue? Do the kids and husband go to bed that night feeling a certain kind of way? Does the mom? Do you think that has an impact on tomorrow? Like, how do the kids interact with their friends tomorrow? Has it changed? Maybe even just a little bit? What about the husband? Or the mom herself? Now, I've just described a pretty complicated situation. But think about how many different ripples needed to happen for that scenario to play out the way that it did. Because it has to kind of start somewhere. So in this scenario, maybe the family goes to bed upset, questioning themselves, wondering why mom is so angry. Is this my fault? And they just end up carrying all that weight for an unknowable amount of time. Maybe it doesn't even last the night, but maybe it does. And maybe the husband then goes and yells at someone else at his job tomorrow. Or the friend yells at a friend of his and they lose a friendship. Who knows? And it has nothing to do with being bad people, because that's not my point at all. But they're carrying a remnant of the last ripple that they encountered. And it's really hard and complicated to assume that these small ripples have an effect. But I have to say, like, much weirder things have happened, right? And maybe one of the kids goes into school and yells at a teacher that day. And maybe that teacher's been fighting sobriety, and this becomes the final straw that sends them back towards the bottle. We have no idea. Maybe a waitress that the husband yells at the next day goes home and unloads on her family, just like his wife did. Now, maybe none of those things happen, but that's kind of my point. We simply just don't know. Not because these things are likely or unlikely or certain or guaranteed or anything like that, but because we never actually know where our ripple will land. Now, these are purposefully negative examples because it illustrates something I think is really easy to miss. It seems to me like we're probably more influential than we often realize, just not necessarily in the way that we often think that we are. And that doesn't mean that we can trace every consequence or every action becomes hyper significant, because we rarely know where our presence actually ends. But we also know that the same ripple travels in both directions. We tend to kind of focus on the family with these examples. But in that example I just gave, something happened to the mom too. There is an inward ripple. Maybe she lies awake replaying that evening and how she handled it. Maybe she feels guilty. Maybe tomorrow she's more defensive. Or maybe she wakes up and apologizes and the family grows from it and throws a different stone the next time. But it seems to me that every stone thrown has the potential to leave a ripple in the person who throws it as well. But life is not normally just the one ripple, the one consequence. Most of us aren't changed by a single conversation. We're changed slowly by hundreds of them. And in the same way I use negative examples, we can go in a different direction. So a kind teacher that gives you a promising word, a counselor, a supportive spouse, a stranger who smiled at you when you needed it. None of them explain who we become. But if you add all of them together, those ripples begin to meet. And they kind of form the world around us. And I think it starts to get interesting here, because there is no guarantee of the path that we've set in motion. Much like, we'll say, a ripple in a lake. Because, like I said, there's two options. The ripple either eventually fizzles out, depending on how big the stone thrown or the situation or action or whatever you want to call it. But the other alternative is what happens when the ripple hits or reaches an immovable object. The power of that ripple can stop right there, or even be redirected in a new direction. And it seems to me, based on my interactions with people, that people are able to choose to become that immovable object. We don't have to pass on what we've been given, especially if it no longer serves our values or our belief systems. And I think that might be like the greatest agency that we have. Being the immovable object does not mean that we are pretending like we weren't hit by something serious or real, or that like nothing ever phases you. It's just not true. What it does mean, though, is deciding that it won't determine the next step that I take, or the next stone or the next ripple that I make. And I feel like it's important to acknowledge, because whether we accept it or not, whether it's our responsibility or not, because I'm not certain that it is, but it is important to remember these things, right? And children are watching. Our spouses are watching. Our friends, coworkers, even strangers at times. They're watching how we are handling those incoming ripples or waves, especially when the water is rough. So it seems to me that the way that we model responding to those moments may become one of the strongest stones we ever throw. And I feel like it works just as powerfully in the positive. Because one act of kindness might be exactly what that teacher or that waitress actually needed that day to reaffirm their fight, right? To help them build on the courage to carry on doing what they're doing. Maybe your presence prevents someone's path of destruction in their own life. Those are all just as real scenarios. Those positive ripples are just as possible as the negative ones. And it's really important to realize this because we get stuck in what we call this negativity bias. And it makes the negative side of things, those negative ripples, feel stronger. And the reason for that is, biologically speaking, human beings are literally designed to pay more credence to danger, to stress, to anxiety. And it's a survival mechanism. It makes it feel more immediate, more pressing, more important. But it's not. It's just as real as the positive stuff. But that negativity bias makes it feel much stronger. Then misery, it turns out, really does seem to love company. So you'll notice people who experience a negative ripple will almost perpetrate it purposefully as some semblance of power to explain why they're experiencing this negative ripple. But by that same promotion, positive ripple seems to strengthen other people's resolves too. And they seem to have the ability to strengthen the world around us. And maybe the most important thing is they can strengthen that inward ripple inside of ourselves. One of the mistakes that I've made, and I've seen others make, is realizing our actions have impact and then trying desperately to manage outcomes. What we want to control, how we're perceived, how others respond to us, what our actions ultimately lead to. And when that fails, as it will inevitably do, we either inflate our responsibility and make it all about my fault, how I did this awful thing, or we abandon responsibility altogether. Now, in shared waters, that idea, it involves some level of compassion because everyone is navigating different conditions. Now, that doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does make the value of your presence more possible. It gives us the ability to throw our stones and make our ripples from a place of intention and morals rather than pure emotion, a whim, or pride. The Stoics wrestled with something very similar more than 2,000 years ago. They argued that we should focus on what's truly up to us, our intentions, our choices, and our responses, while accepting that much, if not everything that follows, simply isn't ours to control. And I'm not sure I would go quite that far, but I do think that they were kind of onto something important. Because perhaps becoming the immovable object is simply one way of putting that same philosophy into practice. It's like a daily wrestle. And I kind of have to push back on my own thinking with that almost every day, especially in counseling. Because if we don't know the stakes, shouldn't we act as if our impact matters even more instead of less? I don't know, for some reason that in my head, it almost seems like we should be more responsible if we're not sure of the outcome of our potential actions. Because I feel like treating these ripple effects that I create in the world as mostly uncontrollable can kind of become complacency. Sometimes maybe even an excuse. Because I think the moral duty we have towards ourselves, our families, and the wider society or shared water, to continue the reference I've been making, it almost feels heavier because of the uncertainty. Because all of those good things tend to take some level of sacrifice. And why sacrifice if you don't know anything positive is going to happen from it? And so I kind of continue to wrestle with this idea. I think we spoke something similar about it in a previous episode on humility. And it can be kind of a heavy duty thought, right? It's a lot to put on us. And maybe the way to think about it is something like it's more about humility than that heavier concept of like duty. Because I feel like both could be true, but just at different moments, right? Like maybe both are true. And maybe that's like the big burden and the issue that keeps coming up around this idea of the ripple effect. Because it seems to me that our presence has impact. Or maybe a better way of saying that would be our presence has the potential to have impact, always. So maybe it's almost something like an acorn, right? Like an acorn isn't an oak tree. Most never become an oak tree. Some are eaten, some dry out. Some never find good soil and just rot in place. But there is always the potential for it to become an oak tree. And perhaps our actions and presence is something like that, where like most of the stones we throw will probably be ordinary and lead to minor ripples that will almost certainly have no impact on anyone else. And maybe they'll just disappear immediately. But every now and then, one will land in exactly the right place and exactly the right condition and exactly to the right person. And the hard part is they don't have to be big or small. It's more about the condition of the waters thrown that the stone is thrown into. And it has nothing to do with because we control the situation, but more because the possibility was always there. So when we share this world with others, with unknown consequences, traveling both outward and inward, each stone that we throw or action that we make seems to carry more potential than we can usually appreciate or acknowledge. And it seems reasonable to me that we're probably responsible for the stone that we decide to throw, right? The specific behavior, the action, the smile, the frown, the scream, any of those. And even if the ripple quickly becomes something we no longer control, the waters still continue to change. And sometimes we'll start to slide. And our stones will start to collide, and other people's stones will start to collide with our own. Maybe their action was heavier than ours. And some will disappear immediately. We'll probably never really know the impact that we have on the world. But I can tell you that the possibilities are more endless than we can imagine. For all you know, that smile that you give that gentleman today is the reason that he's alive tomorrow. And I know that that's heavy, and I don't mean to put that on you as a responsibility because it's not. But tomorrow morning, every one of us will pick up more stones and we'll throw them into the waters. And most of us won't even realize we're doing it. It'll be a conversation, a glance, a moment of patience, maybe a moment of frustration. So knowing that we have the potential to impact the world around us in such a profound way, what do you think we should do with this potential? These ripples. They're not ours to command, the ripples. But the stone, I think the stone just might be. That's how I'm thinking about it for this moment. I hope that it was easy enough to follow. But thank you for thinking it through with me. I would love to hear any counter ideas, arguments, ways you think it's appropriate or not. In the comments, please like and subscribe. The Thoughtful Therapist. I'd like to give a big shout out to Synergy Health Group, again, for their unwavering support throughout this project for me. They're a wonderful company. If anyone needs help, I promise having someone to talk to can be more useful than you could imagine. One might say a very positive ripple. Thank you so much.